The silver cutlery was perfectly aligned. Crystal glasses glistened under warm lighting, casting soft reflections on the marble table. The air inside the grand dining room held its breath. Outside, the hills of Napa lay still, soaked in the final amber hue of dusk. Ileana moved slowly, gracefully even, as she placed the final plate on the table. Grilled sea bass, heirloom tomatoes drizzled with basil oil, and a glass of the Barolo he once swore tasted like memory. Across from her, the chair remained empty. She adjusted the folded linen napkin once more, not because it was crooked, but because her hands needed something to do. Footsteps echoed. Corvin entered wearing the same tailored confidence he wore to every board meeting. His watch, gold and heavy, clicked gently as he loosened his cuff. He glanced at the table, then at her, confused by the softness of the setting. It was quiet. Too quiet. Ileana didn't speak. Instead, she reached into her cardigan pocket, pulled out a single envelope, and placed it beside his wine glass, without a word, without a tremble. She sat down slowly across from him. The moment lasted all of 5 seconds, but it would shatter his entire world. If you believe strength often comes in silence, hit that like button. And if you've ever had to walk away from someone you love to protect your peace, subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Have you ever ignored your instincts, felt them scratching at the edge of your chest, until the truth hit you too late, until the moment came and you realized they were never going to protect what mattered? Corvin Allaire had no idea what was inside that envelope. Not yet. But it would cost him everything. The man who thought he held the entire empire together with charm and contracts was about to discover the one thing he couldn't buy back: trust. Ileana's eyes stayed fixed on her plate. Her hands were still, but inside her, years of quiet hurt, unanswered questions, nights alone with children, asking when Daddy would be home, were settling into something different. Not rage, not grief. Something sharper, certainty. What if the quiet woman everyone underestimated was always 10 steps ahead? Corvin didn't open the envelope right away. Of course he didn't. He poured the wine instead, the bottle breathing its aged secrets into the room. He lifted the glass to his lips, paused, then glanced across the table. "You cooked," he said. Ileana gave a small nod. Not a smile, just acknowledgement. The kind you offer a stranger who's asked for directions and already knows the way. He cut into the fish. The first bite passed without a word. The second followed. And then a sip of wine. Still, he didn't ask. He didn't touch the envelope. She waited. It wasn't a game. She had no interest in theatrics. But after everything he'd hidden, it felt fair to let him wonder for just a moment longer. "I thought you were taking the jet tonight," she said quietly, not looking up. "I postponed," he replied. "Needed to handle a few things here first." She responded, as if it didn't matter, because now it didn't. The mansion felt different tonight. Not colder, not empty, but awake, as if it too had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. He shifted in his seat. "You all right?" Ileana lifted her gaze. It was steady, clear, the kind of look that doesn't seek permission, doesn't flinch, doesn't plead, just is. "I'm fine," she said. "Really." The envelope remained untouched. He glanced at it briefly, then back at her. "What's this?" he asked. Her tone didn't change. "Open it." Corvin hesitated, not because he sensed what was inside, but because he didn't. This woman, the same woman who once wept into his shoulder when her father passed, who traced hearts on the fogged glass of their bedroom windows, who kissed his knuckles before meetings. This woman was looking at him like he was no longer needed, and something in that unsettled him more than anything he'd seen in courtrooms or corporate battles. He reached for the envelope, slowly, almost carefully. The seal opened with a whisper. He unfolded the contents. His eyes moved. First in curiosity, then in confusion, then something else. Stillness. 1 page, 2, 3. He set them down. Divorce filings, custody documentation, legal transfers, full lawful ownership of the estate, no loopholes, no arguments to be made. "I don't understand," he said. But he did. Somewhere inside, he did. Ileana placed her fork gently on the plate. The sound it made felt final. "I gave you years," she said softly. "All I asked for was honesty." He opened his mouth. She raised a hand, just enough to halt words before they began. "You left long before tonight," she said. This is just me catching up. Corvin leaned back in his chair, the paper trembling faintly between his fingers. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the kind of tremor a man hides when he realizes power has shifted and there's no way to take it back. He looked at her. For the first time in years, really looked. The woman across from him wasn't angry. She wasn't weeping or demanding an explanation. She was composed, still, like she'd already walked through every storm and arrived at the other side. "You can't just," he began. "I already did," she replied, calm as still water. "Legally, quietly. Months ago." Corvin blinked, the confusion in his eyes giving way to disbelief. He scanned the documents again, line after line, realizing the precision of it all. The signatures, the timestamps, the notarized seals. "How?" he whispered. "You were busy," she said. "You stopped noticing what mattered." "So I made sure I did." Silence filled the room once more, pressing against the walls. The chandelier above flickered slightly, reflecting in his half-empty glass. He laughed once, dry and hollow. "You planned this?" Ileana tilted her head. "You planned something too, didn't you? Prague, the offshore accounts, the private flights." "We both made plans, Corvin. Yours broke hearts. Mine protected them." Her words weren't cruel. They were factual, delivered with the gentleness of truth spoken too late. He stared down at the papers again, his jaw tightening. "You think this will fix what you've done to us?" She exhaled softly. "No. But it will stop the damage you kept pretending didn't exist." The sound of his glass touching the table felt like punctuation, sharp, abrupt, final. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. "You think you're taking everything from me?" Ileana's eyes softened, almost pitying. "No," she said quietly. "You gave it away, one lie at a time." That struck deeper than she intended. His gaze faltered. For the first time, she saw something fragile flicker behind the mask. Not love, not guilt, but loss. The realization that the woman he once owned in silence had built an entire fortress out of it. Outside, the last light slipped beyond the hills. The windows turned into mirrors, reflecting two people who once shared everything, now separated by truth. Ileana stood, collected, measured. "Dinner's over," she said gently. "You should rest before your flight tomorrow. I won't keep you." He looked up sharply as if to protest, but she was already walking toward the hallway, her steps steady, her posture unbent. The envelope remained between them. Its edges curled slightly, as though the paper itself knew the weight it carried. "Ileana," he called out. She paused at the edge of the hallway. Her hand rested on the dark wood of the doorway, the same wood her father once worked with, now built into a home that no longer belonged to him. "You blindsided me," he said. She turned, slowly. "Did I?" she asked. "Or did you just stop paying attention?" There was no malice in her voice, no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that comes from finally seeing something clearly after years of living in a haze of doubt. Corvin pushed back his chair and stood. The movement was abrupt, reflexive. He stepped toward her, searching her face for something. Softness, hesitation, a crack in her resolve. He found none. "You knew I wasn't ready to lose this," he said, voice low. She held his gaze. "You didn't lose this tonight, Corvin. You lost it the first time you lied to me and decided I wouldn't notice." He blinked. Her words landed not like a slap, but like a cold truth that left no room for denial. She stepped forward, not to meet him, but to move past. But before she did, she stopped just beside him, close enough for him to smell the familiar blend of her skin and the lavender she grew in the orchard. The same orchard he hadn't walked through in years. "Let me be clear," she said, not raising her voice, but cutting through the silence like a razor. "I didn't do this to punish you. I did this to protect myself and our children. What you broke doesn't deserve space in me anymore. What I built, this home, this peace, is mine now." He didn't respond. Couldn't, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been done. She walked away. Her steps echoed not as retreat, but as reclamation. Every footfall a quiet declaration I endured. I learned, and I let go. Corvin stood there in the dining room, alone with the untouched wine, the cooling plate, and a manila envelope filled with the consequences of his own choices. Outside, the orchard swayed gently in the breeze, the only thing that moved in a house no longer his. Ileana Rose grew up in the hush of tall Oregon trees, where the air smelled of cedar and morning fog. Her father built things with his hands, tables, shelves, cribs for neighbors' newborns, and her mother taught children how to read. Their home wasn't large, but it held a kind of stillness that made people linger on the porch before leaving. As a child, Ileana rarely raised her voice. Not because she was shy, but because she didn't need to. People leaned in to hear her, not out of obligation, but because her words always held something worth catching. She'd sit in the corner of the town library, surrounded by worn pages and penciled margins, tracing her fingers across stories of ancient queens, forgotten cities, and lovers who wrote letters by candlelight. She believed the strongest people were the ones who didn't shout to be seen. Her father taught her to sand wood until it was soft as skin. "You can't rush anything worth keeping," he'd say, running his hands across oak grain like it was alive. She listened. She watched. And over time, she began to understand that some things didn't need to be said to be deeply understood. Ileana didn't dream of luxury or status. She wanted warmth. She wanted a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon in winter, a home where someone reached for her hand without being asked. She believed in love the way she believed in seasons, not always gentle, but always returning. At 23, she moved to San Francisco after receiving a graduate scholarship in philosophy and comparative literature. It was a city that pulsed with ambition, but Ileana walked through it like a ghost, wrapped in light, calm in the chaos, never trying to keep up, never needing to. She worked part-time at an art museum's gift shop and volunteered at literacy programs on weekends. It was during one of those evenings, a fundraiser for public school libraries, that she wore an emerald green dress, simple, thrifted, and soft along her collarbones, and caught the attention of a man whose name floated in business circles like a whispered brand. Corvin Allaire. She didn't know who he was at first. He noticed her before she noticed him, not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. She stood near a table of donated first editions, talking to a young boy about the value of stories, her voice low but certain. Corvin watched from a distance, champagne untouched in his hand. When they finally spoke, it was brief, polite, measured, but something in the air between them slowed. He offered to drive her home. She declined. He sent a donation to the library in her name instead. That's when she realized he was watching more than listening. He was calculating, curious, and somehow a little lonely. Still, she wasn't easily pulled. Not yet. They crossed paths again, not by accident. A month after the fundraiser, Ileana returned to the museum late one afternoon to drop off paperwork. Corvin was there, not with anyone, not browsing, just waiting by the sculpture garden. His hands were in his pockets, and his eyes held something unreadable. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me," he said. She did, but she didn't say it. "What brings you to the museum?" she asked. "I'm hoping the lighting is better here than in my office," he said dryly. It wasn't a charming line, but there was something vulnerable about the way he delivered it. Not rehearsed, just tired. They walked together, not far, not long. He didn't ask for her number. She didn't offer it. But the next week, he sent a signed first edition copy of Letters to a Young Poet to her. Mailbox, no note, no name, just wrapped in ivory paper with a single pressed leaf inside. Ileana stood in her apartment that evening, turning the book in her hands, unsure whether to be flattered or concerned. But the gesture felt careful, and that mattered to her more than grand declarations. Their relationship never exploded into existence. It bloomed, slowly, quietly, like a warm light rising behind closed curtains. He didn't bring her to events. He didn't post photos, but he showed up, for long walks in the botanical gardens, for late dinners in out-of-the-way places where the staff greeted him with bowed heads and whispered greetings, not out of reverence, but habit. Corvin Allaire, even in silence, was someone people noticed. But Ileana, she never asked about the wealth. She didn't need to. She asked about his childhood instead, his mother, his dreams before they were converted into companies. And he told her things she suspected no one else knew, like the way he used to sneak into his high school lab to build circuits alone at night, how he used to record his father's arguments with investors just to study the tone of power, or how, despite everything, he had no idea what peace felt like. One night, under a canopy of stars behind a vineyard guest house, she asked him softly, "Do you ever read?" He looked up at the sky. "I wouldn't know how." She touched his wrist. You'll have to learn. It wasn't flirtation, it was invitation. And he accepted. The more they spent time together, the quieter he became. Not withdrawn, but still, as if she slowed something in him that had been running far too fast for far too long. He gave her space. He never flooded her with attention or demands, but he listened, closely, and Ileana, for the first time in her adult life, felt seen, not because of what she said, but because of how carefully he remembered. Still, there was always a part of her that stayed alert, watching, not because she didn't trust him, but because she understood that some people live their entire lives behind doors they never open. She was never going to push his open. She would wait to be let in, but only for so long. They spent a week in Tuscany the following spring, not for a vacation, but because Ileana wanted to walk where the ground felt old, where silence hummed between stone walls and olive trees. Corvin booked a private estate tucked behind worn iron gates. The days passed slowly, fresh bread in the morning, vineyard strolls in the afternoon, and soft music echoing through archways in the evening. On the 5th day, as the sun bowed low over the hills, he led her through a grove of ancient olive trees, their limbs twisted, wise. The light fell gently on her shoulders as if the sky itself had paused to watch. He didn't kneel. He simply turned to her and said, "I don't know how to be everything you deserve, but I know I feel more human beside you than I ever have alone. If you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life learning how to be better." Ileana didn't cry. She didn't gasp or cover her mouth. She reached forward, took the ring from his open palm and slipped it on herself. "I'm not saying yes for your empire," she whispered. "I'm saying yes for the way you breathe when you're with me. Quiet, real." He looked at her like a man watching light move through glass, unsure how it happened, only that it mattered. They were married 8 weeks later. No magazine covers, no headlines, just a handwritten ceremony under sycamore trees with fewer than 20 people in attendance. Her dress was soft, made from linen she found in a small shop near the university. His suit was simple, charcoal gray. There were no photographers, no orchestra, but there was a kind of stillness that wrapped around them like the start of something rare. After the vows, Ileana stood beside him and watched their guests sip wine and laugh in the garden. Corvin leaned down and whispered, "You changed everything I thought I knew about what matters." She turned to him. "Good. Because now we build from here." The mansion began with her dreams. She never wanted marble pillars or imported chandeliers. She wanted light, rooms that breathed, a nursery with painted clouds on the ceiling and low bookshelves a child could reach, an orchard filled with real fruit and wild herbs, a kitchen large enough for dancing. She told Corvin she missed the scent of Oregon pine. 3 weeks later, he flew in reclaimed wood from her father's old supplier and had it placed along the library's beams. She didn't ask for that, but she noticed. He commissioned the build quietly, privately. The blueprints weren't filed through his company. The land purchase was silent. When he unveiled the foundation to her, she stood barefoot on the soil and whispered, "This doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a beginning." Corvin nodded. "That's exactly what it's supposed to be." The mansion stood finished 18 months later, not as a monument to wealth, but as a quiet reflection of Ileana herself. Wide hallways that invited laughter to echo, archways carved with soft curves, walls painted in earth tones pulled from Oregon forests and Italian sunsets. Every detail had purpose. Nothing was showy, yet everything spoke. The nursery sat at the top of the stairs, just left of the reading loft. She had painted clouds on the ceiling by hand, soft shapes that drifted above the crib like daydreams. The bookshelf held classics from her childhood and a few new titles sent by friends who couldn't wait to meet the twins. Ileana spent hours in that room before the babies arrived, curled in the rocking chair, breathing in the scent of fresh cotton and unfinished wood. She said their names aloud before they were born, like promises whispered into the air. When the children came, a boy and a girl, the house finally felt full. Corvin was there that day. He held them both, one arm cradling each newborn, and smiled in a way Ileana would always remember. He wasn't the man she saw in meetings. He wasn't the name printed on company letters. He was just a man who had no words, holding everything he didn't know he needed. In those first years, the house rang with lullabies, the soft creak of the rocking chair, the scuff of bare feet on polished floors. Corvin tried to be present, He held them when they cried. He let Ileana fall asleep in the library while he fed them bottles warmed under moonlight. There were moments when it felt like they were both living the dream they'd once stood barefoot in the dirt and imagined. And yet, she noticed how quickly his eyes shifted back to his phone after kissing their foreheads, how meetings stretched longer, how the wine he once saved for special occasions began to appear on ordinary Tuesdays. He still brought her gifts, still remembered her favorite tea, but sometimes the warmth behind his eyes wasn't there. Ileana didn't say anything, not yet. She tucked it away, a thought wrapped in quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't shout, but watches, the kind that waits to see if something will return before accepting that it's already gone. If you think love should be built on trust and not just treasure, comment below with real love matters. The twins turned 3 just after the apricot trees bloomed. Ileana baked the cake herself, a vanilla sponge with handmade cream and strawberry filling. She stayed up the night before in the kitchen, her hair tied back, fingers dusted with flour, humming a soft tune that only the walls heard. The children would never remember that cake, but she wanted them to. Grow up in a house where birthdays were felt, not just celebrated. Corvin was supposed to arrive home that afternoon. His assistant called just after noon. "A board conflict," she said. "He sends his love." Ileana stood there, phone in hand, frosting spoon resting against the counter's edge. She didn't cry, didn't sigh, just nodded, even though the assistant couldn't see her. The party went on. A few close friends, laughter in the garden, the twins covered in frosting. Guests lingered by the orchard, commenting on how lucky they were, how perfect everything looked. Ileana smiled when she needed to. But as the sun dipped behind the hills and the guests said their goodbyes, she stood alone in the backyard, barefoot, in the grass, staring at the empty second-floor balcony where Corvin usually appeared with wine and a tired grin. He didn't come home that night. The change hadn't happened all at once. It began with the calls, short, clipped, often taken in the wine cellar or out by the fountain after dark. Then came the meetings, extended, relocated, untouched plates at dinner, half-packed bags left near the door, always ready to go somewhere he didn't name. He still kissed the children goodnight, still asked Ileana how her day was, but the space between them grew in ways that couldn't be measured by distance alone. One evening, she noticed he'd replaced their framed family photo in his office with an abstract painting, sharp strokes, cool colors, the kind of piece that fills a room without saying anything. She asked about it. He said the photo didn't match the lighting. That night, Ileana stood at the doorway of their bedroom, watching him sleep from the hallway. His body faced away from her. The covers rose and fell in a steady rhythm. She remembered how, during their first year of marriage, he used to reach for her hand in his sleep. He hadn't done that in months. The twins were thriving, curious, full of questions. They pulled at her skirt when she read in the kitchen and begged her to sing when brushing their hair. Ileana poured everything into them, her time, her warmth, her quiet devotion. But even the children began to notice. "Why doesn't Daddy eat with us anymore?" her daughter asked one evening, pushing carrots around her plate. Ileana smoothed her daughter's hair and answered gently, "He's working hard, that's all." She didn't believe her own words. Not anymore. Corvin came home that weekend. He entered just after midnight, the door closing softly behind him. Ileana lay awake in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She heard him remove his shoes, hang his coat, walk down the hallway. Each sound was familiar, yet carried none of the comfort it once held. She didn't speak when he slid into bed beside her. She didn't turn toward him. Neither did he. The next morning, she rose before the sun, fed the children, tended to the herbs in the courtyard. He stayed in bed, claiming exhaustion. By the time he appeared, hours later, the children were already down for their nap and Ileana was in the orchard, clipping dried branches in silence. He called out to her. She turned, smiled, said nothing else. Something in her had begun to close, not from bitterness, but necessity. He started spending more time in the East Wing, the one they once used for guests and late-night readings. Now it was filled with documents, monitors, conversations behind closed doors. The twins weren't allowed in there. She wasn't invited either. At first, Ileana tried. She'd bring him coffee or tea, rest her hand lightly on his shoulder, ask about his day. But the answers came shorter each time. His posture stayed stiff, his mind elsewhere. She once asked who he was speaking to so late, after midnight. He smiled, a practiced one, and said, "Just someone from the Tokyo team. No name, no further detail." Just a gentle nudge toward the end of the conversation. Ileana stopped asking. That winter, the garden froze early. Ileana spent more time inside with the children, teaching them how to write their names and flower on the kitchen table, reading them bedtime stories from the same worn books she once loved as a girl. At night, after they were asleep, she would sit alone in the nursery. The walls were still painted with clouds, but something in the room had shifted. Not the decor, the atmosphere. A kind of quiet that pressed against her chest. She used to wait up for Corvin. Now she didn't. One evening, he returned home while she was folding laundry in the den. The children were in bed. The fire crackled behind her, the scent of pine wood filling the room. She asked how his trip had gone. He said it was productive. She nodded and turned back to the clothes. He watched her for a moment. "You don't ask much anymore," he said. Ileana looked up, folding a small sweater. "No, I suppose I don't." There was a pause. "I thought you liked honesty." "I do," she said, laying the sweater in the basket. "But I learned that asking too many questions doesn't guarantee truthful answers. So I saved my breath." He said nothing. She didn't look up again. The house had grown too quiet. Not peaceful, just still in a way that made every small sound feel amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of wood when the heater started, the muffled buzz of Corvin's phone against the marble counter in the middle of the night. Ileana began noticing patterns. The way he always stepped out to take calls near the fountain, far from open doors. The way his laptop screen dimmed whenever she entered the room. How he changed passwords that used to be shared. Once she reached for his tablet to find a recipe she'd saved months earlier. It was locked. That had never happened before. She asked about it the next morning. He brushed it off. "Security update," he said. "New company policy." He kissed her cheek before leaving, his tone perfectly smooth. Too smooth, like someone reading from a script. That was the moment Ileana realized how much silence could hide. The children were growing, asking more questions. "When will Daddy eat dinner with us? Why does he stay in his office so long?" Ileana answered softly each time, but after the fifth or sixth question, her voice began to falter. She didn't want them to learn what distance sounded like before they could even spell the word. One afternoon, while putting away freshly laundered sheets, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She hardly recognized the reflection. Her face was calm, but her eyes had changed. They no longer searched for explanations. They simply recorded them. That evening, she decided she needed to know. It was near midnight when she heard the faint murmur of voices outside the terrace doors. Corvin's tone was low, cautious. The other voice, a woman's, carried a softness that didn't belong to business conversations. Ileana froze at the hallway entrance. The glass doors were half open. A cool breeze drifted in, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and wine. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. "Don't worry," Corvin was saying. "She suspects nothing." Ileana's heartbeat slowed, not quickened. There was no outburst, no rush of tears. Just stillness, a sharp, clear understanding settling like frost. The woman laughed lightly. "You always say that." There was a pause. Then softer, "You miss me?" Corvin didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "You know I do." Ileana turned away. Not because she couldn't bear to hear it, but because she didn't want to remember more than that. She'd learned that some truths didn't need every detail to destroy you. A few words were enough. She walked back through the hallway, her bare feet silent against the floor. The walls seemed taller, the air thinner. Her wedding photo hung by the staircase, the one taken under the sycamores. She stared at it for a long moment, tracing the frame with her fingertip. She remembered how he had held her then, not like possession, but promise. Now, it felt like both had broken. Ileana didn't wake him later that night. Didn't ask, didn't cry. She simply lay beside him in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her breath even, and her mind clearer than it had been in months. This wasn't shock anymore. It was confirmation, and it didn't bring rage. It brought resolve. In the days that followed, Ileana changed. Not outwardly. She still smiled at the twins during breakfast, still trimmed herbs for the evening stew, still greeted the staff by name. But inside, a door had closed, and behind it, she began taking careful notes. She wasn't naive. She had spent years reading about human nature, how people reveal themselves not in speeches, but in patterns. The times they slip up, the stories that shift, the pauses between sentences. So she listened, differently. Corvin continued as if nothing had changed. His calls grew more frequent, his stays shorter. When he returned, he brought gifts, scarves she never asked for, jewelry too expensive for the life she preferred. He was no longer trying to connect. He was trying to distract. Ileana accepted everything with a soft thank you, then quietly placed each item in the drawer beneath her desk. She didn't sell them, didn't wear them. She kept them untouched. Evidence. One evening, after Corvin left for a trip he hadn't discussed in advance, Ileana found herself in the East Wing, the space he'd turned into his own domain. The door was unlocked. The room smelled of coffee and leather. Papers covered the desk, some with codes and figures, others with vague project names. But tucked beneath one corner was something she hadn't expected to find, a printed itinerary. Flight bookings, hotel confirmations, not to Tokyo, but to Prague. Her breath stayed calm. She didn't take the papers. She photographed them with the old camera she used for family scrapbooks, quiet, with no digital trace. Later that night, after the twins fell asleep, she opened the computer in her studio. She searched for the name she had seen listed on several transfers. Renata Vide. The results came slowly, scattered, nothing suspicious at first. But deeper digging revealed connections, a property listed under a holding company, tied to an offshore account. A foundation donation made from one of Corvin's subsidiaries. Photos from a private event overseas, him, half-turned, her hand on his arm. Ileana's stomach didn't twist. There was no panic, no scene. Only stillness. Only truth. She closed the browser and sat back, staring at the shadows across the ceiling. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who believed kindness alone could anchor a home. And then she thought of her children, of what they deserved. This wasn't about betrayal anymore. This was about protection. The next morning she contacted someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Ilana Chen, a classmate from her graduate program who had gone on to specialize in discrete asset security and legal strategy. They met over tea in a quiet garden cafe outside Sonoma. Ileana didn't speak right away. When she finally did, she wasn't dramatic. She was detailed. Ilana listened carefully, taking notes. "You're not here to fight," she said softly. "You're here to prepare." Ileana nodded. "I'm not angry. I'm awake." And that changed everything. From that moment on, she moved with purpose. Quietly, deliberately, she began shifting small assets into trusts under her name. She updated estate documentation, nothing fraudulent, nothing hidden, just what was rightfully hers, secured before it could disappear. She made copies of everything, stored them in fireproof boxes in separate locations, began asking subtle questions of the household staff, not to trap them, but to confirm what she already knew. She never confronted Corvin. Not once. She wanted truth, not theater. And in the silence, she realized something powerful. She had stopped trying to save the marriage. Now, she was saving herself. Ileana didn't act immediately. She listened. She studied. She moved slowly, not out of fear, but precision. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, the kind that grows under pressure, like roots under stone. Corvin still came and went, as if the house belonged only to him. The children greeted him with hugs, unaware of the widening distance between their parents. Ileana kept her smile gentle, her voice calm, but everything inside her was sharpening. In the past, she had chosen patience. Now, she was choosing clarity. She began where she always had, in books. Her study became a quiet chamber of research, scattered with volumes on estate, law, trust structures, international finance, and behavioral psychology. This wasn't a reaction. It was strategy. Philosophy had taught her to pay attention not just to what people say, but how they behave when they believe no one is watching. She remembered lectures on moral erosion, on the slow decay of truth. Betrayal rarely appears with a bang. It arrives slowly, cloaked in plausible explanations, until you can no longer remember what it felt like to be safe. Corvin had left her long before she overheard that late-night conversation. He had been leaving in pieces. What remained was just a shell filled with absence. Every Wednesday morning, Ileana drove into Sonoma, told the staff she was taking a class at the Botanical Center. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She met Ilana at a private office tucked behind a discreet financial firm. Ilana had transitioned from academic to attorney with the same clarity Ileana now moved with. They spoke plainly. There was no panic, no tears, just facts. Ileana laid out the timeline, the photos, the travel records, the financial discrepancies. Ilana reviewed them one by one, taking notes. "You're early," she said after their second meeting. Ileana looked up. "Early? Most women come when it's too late, when he's already moved funds, erased trails. You still have time, you still have leverage." Ileana nodded. That was the point. Over the course of 6 weeks, she and Ilana crafted a quiet plan. The mansion, once gifted to Ileana in sentiment but structured under Corvin's holding company, would be the centerpiece. Through careful restructuring, legal filings, and the use of inheritance clauses from her parents' modest estate, they worked to shift ownership into a private family trust, hers alone. The legal language was complex, but the outcome was clean. Ileana would own the property, fully, legally, permanently, and he wouldn't know. Not yet. Back at home, Ileana moved through her routines like always. She prepared meals, hosted playdates, kissed scraped knees, managed household accounts. But in the quiet hours of the morning, she reviewed documents with Ilana, filed motions, through encrypted channels, and rewrote the future of her children's security. Each step was quiet, controlled, like trimming dead branches from a tree, one cut at a time. She spent more time in the orchard again. It had always been her place of stillness, but now it served another purpose. As she walked between the rows, she clipped what no longer bore fruit. She cleared space for what would grow next. It wasn't a metaphor when she began saying aloud what she knew to be true. "This no longer serves," she whispered, pruning shears in hand. She wasn't speaking of the trees. Inside, she removed the framed wedding photo from the hallway. Not in anger, not as a message. It simply didn't belong anymore. She placed it in a storage box along with other keepsakes, the love letters from Tuscany, the bracelet he gave her the day the twins were born, the ribbon from the nursery's naming ceremony. It wasn't mourning. It was release. In the 7th week, Ilana called her with a simple confirmation. "It's done," she said. "The mansion is yours." Ileana didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She just breathed, deeply, evenly, as if her lungs had finally remembered how. Drop A in the comments if you believe protecting your peace is power, even when no one is watching. Ileana had always handled the family accounts, not because Corvin asked her to, but because she knew the rhythm of their lives better than anyone. She tracked the monthly expenses, organized donations, and scheduled maintenance on the estate. It gave her a clear window into what flowed in and what went missing. Now, she looked at it differently. She wasn't scanning numbers. She was mapping behavior. Transfers to companies with vague names, recurring deposits to consulting firms that listed no staff, monthly payments to a foreign address under a foundation that had no online presence. The pattern was there, subtle, but visible to someone who knew where to look. She compiled it all. Ilana reviewed each transaction and began securing everything Ileana had claimed. 2 joint accounts, inherited assets, life insurance, long-term equity shares. It took time and care. But by the end of the 2nd month, Ileana had quietly fortified her financial ground. She didn't take what wasn't hers. She simply reclaimed what Corvin assumed she'd never reach for. In conversations, Corvin remained confident, detached but controlled. He still complimented her meals, still kissed her cheek when leaving for flights, still sent flowers when meetings kept him away. Ileana accepted each gesture the same way she accepted a passing wind. It came. It went. It changed nothing. Once, over dinner, he mentioned bringing on a new partner for a startup in Southeast Asia. "Long hours," he said. "I might need to be there more often." Ileana stirred her tea and said, "Whatever helps you sleep at night." He paused, just for a second, then nodded, choosing not to ask what she meant. He'd grown too used to her silence. He didn't realize she was using it. She requested updated birth certificates for the twins. Not unusual, not suspicious. She then had their education accounts restructured, placing full administrative authority under her name. She revised her medical directives, redrew guardianship rights, adjusted her will. Each step was documented, reviewed, sealed. When Ilana asked if she wanted to file a temporary restraining order on financial transactions, Ileana shook her head. "Not yet," she said. I'm not here to punish him. I'm here to protect what matters. Ilana smiled faintly. You're probably the calmest client I've ever worked with. Ileana looked down at the documents. I stopped expecting him to change. That's when everything got easier. She returned to the orchard weekly, pruning with more certainty than ever. Her hands no longer trembled with indecision. They moved with purpose. She didn't think of Corvin often. Not anymore. Her thoughts were with the future. She began researching mentorship programs for single mothers. Foundations that offered temporary housing for women transitioning out of controlling relationships. The more she read, the more she saw her story in fragments, told not through violence, but through erasure, through forgetting, through assuming she would always stay quiet. Not anymore. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in the study, she heard her daughter's voice from the hallway. Mommy, what's a prenup? Ileana looked up, heart steady. Where did you hear that word? Daddy said it on the phone. Ileana smiled gently. It's something grown-ups talk about. You don't need to worry. Her daughter nodded and ran off. Ileana closed the folder in her lap. She already knew what Corvin was planning. He was preparing for an ending. What he didn't know was that she had already arrived there before him. He still believed control was held through presence, the occasional gift, the right words at the right time, a performance that looked like care. But Ileana had stopped watching his actions for meaning. She had stopped hoping for the man she married to return. That part of her was done. Now, everything she did was with her children in mind. She spoke to educators. She met with therapists who specialized in childhood transitions. She spoke to women who had walked away from marriages they once called safe, not for drama, not for attention, just for knowledge. When she wasn't with the children or handling documents, she found herself journaling again, something she hadn't done since her early 20s, not to vent, but to organize her thoughts. The entries weren't long. They were observations, moments, memories she didn't want to distort later. One afternoon, she wrote, he didn't destroy us all at once. He disappeared one small absence at a time. That sentence stayed with her for days. Her meetings with Ilana continued, shorter now, more focused. There were fewer questions to ask. Most of the puzzle had been solved. The assets were protected. The estate was secured. The accounts that once felt impossible to separate had been unwound with care. I think we're there, Ilana told her one morning. You're ready for the next step. Ileana nodded. It's strange how quiet it feels. That's how you know it's real, Ilana said. No panic, just peace. Ileana smiled. Exactly. At home, she began cleaning out drawers, not because she had to, but because she no longer needed to hold on. She sorted clothing into boxes, removed photos from walls, tucked away gifts that once made her heart race. There were no tears. Letting go wasn't grief anymore. It was a return to herself. She also wrote a letter to the household staff, one she wouldn't share yet. In it, she thanked them for their service. She outlined the transition, assured them of stability. She knew some of them had already suspected a shift. The subtle tension, the difference in energy. People notice, even if they don't speak. Corvin returned from a 4-day trip without warning. Ileana was in the garden when he arrived, her hands in the soil, planting new lavender along the walkway. He approached, briefcase in hand, sunglasses still on. Didn't know you'd be out here, he said. I live here, she replied, not looking up. He chuckled. Fair enough. He leaned in for a kiss. She turned her head. He paused. Something wrong? No, she said. Everything's in its place. He raised an eyebrow, studying her. Ileana stood, brushed her hands on her apron, and walked past him toward the house. There was nothing left to explain. She had already said goodbye in every way that mattered. Later that evening, she made herself tea and sat on the terrace alone. The twins were asleep. Corvin was on yet another call. She looked out across the orchard, its branches moving gently in the late breeze. New growth had begun. The fruit wouldn't come for months, but the promise of it was there. That was enough. Ileana stood in the library 2 days later, holding a simple envelope. It looked no different from the ones Corvin's assistants used for scheduling memos or hotel confirmations. There was no wax seal, no dramatic packaging, just a plain sleeve, neutral, quiet, unassuming. Inside were 4 documents, her statement, the divorce papers, the updated deed, and the custodial agreements drawn up with care clarity, and zero margin for manipulation. She had reviewed them 3 times, not out of doubt, but to feel the finality in her hands. This was not a question. It was a boundary. She placed the envelope inside the drawer beside the dining room table, the same one where she once kept napkin rings and spare candles. She didn't lock it. She didn't hide it. The moment would come when it was meant to. Until then, everything stayed in motion. She spoke to the children's teacher to confirm their schooling schedule for the coming month, arranged for their godparents to stay with them the following weekend. She wrote a personal letter for each child, not to be opened now but later, something for when they were older, when questions came, when memory blurred. Each letter began the same way. I did this for you, so you'd grow up knowing strength doesn't have to be loud. When she finished, she walked through the house slowly, room by room. She stopped in the nursery, sat for a while in the rocking chair, running her fingers over the worn armrest where she once hummed lullabies in the dark. She visited the reading loft, the garden path, the back stairwell where the twins used to race after bath time, wrapped in towels like capes. She wasn't clinging to the past. She was acknowledging it. It was hers, all of it. And now, she would carry only what mattered forward. That evening, Corvin returned from a business dinner in the city. Ileana had already set the table. Grilled sea bass, roasted root vegetables, a glass of red poured and waiting, his favorite. He walked in, surprised by the formality. Company? She shook her head. Just us. He sat. They ate. Small talk came easily to him. It always had. He told her about a pitch deck, a new investor, a change in board structure. She listened with her hands folded on her lap. When he reached for his wine glass, she rose and retrieved the envelope. She placed it beside his plate, then sat back down. Corvin looked at it, brows tightening. What's this? Ileana's voice was calm. Read it. He opened it slowly, as if expecting a note. He scanned the first page, eyes shifting. The second page brought silence. The third, stunned stillness. He looked up at her. You planned this. Her reply was soft. You taught me how. He swallowed. This isn't how. It's exactly how, she interrupted. I trusted you to lead with truth. You chose something else. I gave you everything. Ileana tilted her head. You gave me silence, secrets. Long nights alone and lies I had to pretend not to hear. He stared at the documents again. You went behind my back. No, she said. I stepped out of your shadow. He tried logic, then guilt, then disbelief. But every page was stamped, every account verified, every motion protected. There was nothing he could undo without exposing himself further. She had built a case he couldn't contest, not because it was aggressive, but because it was undeniable. When his voice grew sharper, Ileana stood and began clearing the plates. Calmly, one by one, as if it were any other night. You're making a mistake, he said finally. She turned to him, voice even. The mistake was believing I needed you more than I needed peace. He stood, unsure of what to do. His world hadn't exploded. It had been dismantled, piece by piece, by the woman he stopped paying attention to. She met his eyes. You can leave tomorrow, or tonight. That's your choice. But this house, this life, these children, they stay with me. Corvin didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. Corvin arrived home just past 9 p.m., his driver pulling through the gate that had, until now, always opened without hesitation. This time, it didn't. The gate lights blinked twice before unlocking. He frowned, but said nothing. The car rolled up the curved driveway, past the trimmed hedges and dormant orchard. The house glowed softly in the dark, but the porch light was dimmer than usual. A subtle difference, but it caught him. Inside, the house was still. He stepped through the front door and paused. No welcome, no footsteps, no scent of a freshly prepared meal greeting him. Only silence. He set his bag down and checked his phone. 2 unread messages, both work-related. He replied to neither. As he moved toward the east wing, he reached for the keypad on the office. Vault, his usual rhythm, 5 digits, pause, second code, enter. Nothing happened. He tried again. Access denied. He looked closer. The panel had been updated. New hardware, new sequence. His chest tightened. He headed to the guest house entrance, a small key fob in his pocket. But when he waved it over the sensor, the lock didn't release. He checked the fob, tried again, still locked. He walked faster now, back into the main hall past the paintings Ileana had chosen herself. Their frames had been moved slightly, realigned, centered, the kind of detail most wouldn't notice, but she would. He entered the kitchen. On the counter sat a single glass of red wine. Not his usual Bordeaux, but something softer. Next to it, a plate covered with linen. He lifted the cloth. Sea bass. Chilled. Already plated. He turned. Ileana stood in the dining room doorway. She didn't say a word. She simply gestured toward the table. He hesitated. But then he sat. She walked over and placed a second glass across from him. For a long moment, they said nothing. He broke the silence first. Something happened with the system. The office vault won't open. I had it changed. He waited. I wasn't informed. I know, she replied. He looked at her now, really looked. She wasn't distant. She wasn't warm. She was still, completely still. He reached for his fork, then paused. You've been busy. She sat down slowly. I had things to protect. The silence thickened. He took a bite, chewing carefully, watching her. What changed? Ileana lifted her wineglass and sipped. Nothing changed. You just finally came home after everything had. He pushed the plate aside and leaned forward. I know what you're doing. She tilted her head. Do you? He nodded once. You think you've won something. That this is power. She didn't flinch. No. This is peace. You locked me out of my own home. Ileana's tone was steady. You were never in it. His expression flickered. She reached beneath the table and pulled out a familiar envelope. The same one she'd placed there nights ago. She slid it across the table, slow and deliberate. You should read it. Corvin didn't touch it. Instead, he sat back, arms crossed. You're bluffing. Open it. He stared at the envelope for several seconds before finally breaking the seal. The pages inside were the same. Stamped, dated, irrefutable. His face changed. Subtly, but enough. He looked up. You planned this. Ileana's reply came without pause. You left me no choice. If you've ever had to let someone go, not out of hate but for your own healing, share this story. Someone out there needs to hear it. Corvin stood, jaw clenched, the papers trembling slightly in his hand. You blindsided me, he said at last. Ileana took another sip of wine. I gave you years. You think this is fair? Her gaze was level. Fair doesn't live in betrayal. It drowns in it. His eyes moved over the paperwork again, looking for a flaw, a gap, something to argue. But it was flawless. Legally bound. Ethically constructed. Unshakable. I built all of this, he said under his breath, gesturing to the house. You wouldn't even be here without me. She nodded. You built the walls. I made it a home. You had power. I held the foundation. You spent. I stayed. That last word echoed. He knew what it meant. I gave you everything, he repeated, almost desperately now. Ileana didn't flinch. No, you gave me what was convenient, and took what you assumed I'd never defend. He walked toward the terrace doors, his back turned, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, quietly, you really did this. You had it all done behind my back. No, she said. I did it in front of your absence. He turned sharply. You didn't even try to fix it. I tried, she said, voice calm. I stayed through the first lie, and the second, and the year you spent more time with your phone than your family. I begged you with silence, Corvin. I waited for something real to return. He swallowed hard. You were never going to leave, though. You don't have it in you. Ileana leaned forward. I didn't leave. You did. I just caught up. He stared at her for a long time, then sat down, exhausted. There's got to be a way to undo this. There isn't. He scoffed. You think you're in control? I'm not in control, she replied. I'm in truth. There's a difference. His voice lowered, laced with warning. You're really going to make me fight this? Ileana stood, collected the papers, and slid them neatly back into the envelope. No, I'm giving you a choice. One you never gave me. She placed the envelope back on the table. Sign quietly. Leave clean. or turn this into a war. But know this, the truth doesn't need volume to win. Corvin was quiet for a long time. She didn't wait for a response. She rose from the table, turned off the light, and left him sitting in the soft dimness of the room. He looked around the house he once commissioned like a masterpiece. Every detail, every material, every inch curated to impress. Now, it felt unfamiliar. Not because it changed, because it no longer belonged to him. He stood, walked the hall slowly, opening doors as if hoping to find a version of his life still frozen in time. But the rooms didn't echo anymore. They breathed differently, lighter, as if they'd been waiting for him to leave. He entered the nursery. The cloud-painted ceiling remained untouched, but something about the air in the room told him the story had already moved on without him. There was a small folded blanket on the rocking chair, one he hadn't seen before. Next to it, a note, handwritten in his daughter's messy print, for Mommy, because she reads us all the best books. Corvin didn't touch it. He simply stood there, in a house filled with memories he no longer owned. The next morning, Ileana woke early. She didn't check her phone. She didn't look for him. She made breakfast as she always did, measured, calm, simple. Her hands moved with the ease of habit, not tension. The children came downstairs half awake, their small voices rising in laughter over cereal. She tied back their hair, wiped their cheeks, packed their lunches. There was no sign of Corvin. She didn't ask. At 9:12 a.m., the front door clicked open, then closed again. He didn't speak. He didn't linger. A suitcase rolled softly across the floor. Leather shoes echoed lightly against the tile. She heard the pause at the threshold, long enough for him to want to say something. But he didn't. He left, not with rage, not with a parting insult, just with the realization that nothing he could say would alter the truth she had already claimed. Ileana didn't watch from the window. She had nothing left to prove. Later that day, the housekeeper quietly asked, "Will he be returning soon?" Ileana answered simply, "No, not to this home." There was no elaboration, none needed. The staff adjusted. The children asked fewer questions than she expected. Children understand more than adults give them credit for, especially the shift in a mother's peace. Ileana filled the space he left with something better. Not noise, stillness. In the weeks that followed, Ileana finalized everything. The legal filings moved forward without resistance. The deed had already been secured. The court accepted the terms of separation and custody. There were no battles, no drawn-out proceedings. He didn't fight her. He knew he couldn't win what he'd already lost. The house began to feel lighter. Ileana walked the hallways at night with no heaviness in her chest. The library became a place of inspiration again. The kitchen filled with the scent of cardamom and citrus, not the silence of cold dinners waiting for an absent guest. She even reopened the guest wing, but not for him. She converted it into a writing studio, a space just for her. One evening she took a bottle of wine and sat on the terrace as the sun dipped below the orchard line. She didn't need company. She didn't need applause. She needed a moment to mark what had ended and what had begun. Ileana had not burned her past. She had outgrown it. And in its place she built something far more valuable than vengeance, sovereignty. The mansion no longer felt cold. The silence wasn't heavy now. It was peaceful. Ileana stood in the garden just after sunrise, fingers brushing through rosemary and sage. Where once her mornings had been filled with carefully applied makeup and scheduled brunches, now they began with bare feet in damp soil and the scent of lemon blossoms drifting through the air. She no longer needed perfection. She needed purpose. Weeks after Corvin left, she began the restoration quietly. Not of the house. It didn't need more chandeliers or imported tile. It needed soul. Ileana walked from room to room, this time not as a keeper of someone else's empire, but as a builder of her own legacy. The first to change was the West Wing. Once reserved for parties, it was stripped of velvet ropes and ego. In its place, soft rugs, open bookshelves, blankets on every armrest. The room became a reading retreat for women who had survived what she had, or worse. They came with tired eyes and hesitant smiles, but they left with journals full of poetry and voices no longer afraid of being heard. The pool house was next. It had once hosted investors. Now it welcomed single mothers, trauma survivors, and daughters who needed silence to sort through their stories. No therapy signs, no announcements, just a quiet place to be safe. Ileana didn't call it a center. She never put up a sign. She simply opened her doors and let people heal the way they needed to. She didn't speak often about what had happened, not because it hurt, though some of it still did, but because she had already turned the final page. Instead, she poured herself into something new. She planted vegetables, learned about herbal teas, lit candles not to cover anything up, but to celebrate what was finally clean. And slowly, like her orchard, she began to bloom. One morning, she met him. Matteo. He wasn't glamorous. He didn't arrive in a tailored suit or with rehearsed charm. He wore worn boots, calloused hands, and kindness that didn't come with conditions. He'd come to inspect the health of her soil. Ileana had almost canceled the appointment. She wasn't in the mood for small talk. But he arrived with quiet respect, not rushing her, not lingering too long in his gaze. He listened when she spoke, not just nodded, listened. He ran his hand along the base of a struggling plum tree and said, "This one's holding pain, but if we move it slightly, just a few feet, it'll catch sun again." She didn't know why, but her throat caught, not from the tree, from the way he saw it, from the way he saw her. She offered him tea that day. He didn't flirt. He didn't pry. He thanked her and left with the same calm presence he arrived with. A week later, she invited him back to walk the orchard with her. She didn't realize she smiled the whole time until Arya said, "Mommy, your face is lighter now." Ileana didn't rush the connection. She had once built a life at lightning speed, courted under Tuscan skies, married. By the turn of a season, swept into promises dressed as permanence. This time, she moved like water finding its level. Matteo came and went with no expectations. He pruned the trees, fixed the irrigation lines, brought fresh basil from his greenhouse. She made tea, sometimes bread, sometimes silence, and still he stayed, not as a fixture, but as someone who asked nothing except to know her honestly. It wasn't until Kaylin came home from school with scraped knees that the shift happened. Matteo had been tending to a fig tree when the cry rang out. Ileana rushed forward, heart pounding, but it was Matteo who knelt first, careful hands, gentle voice. "Let's check the damage," he said softly. No dramatics, no overreaction. He washed the wound, wrapped it neatly, handed the boy a strip of fruit leather from his pocket. Kaylin stared up at him and asked, "Are you a doctor?" "No," Matteo chuckled. "Just someone who's fallen down a lot." The boy grinned, and Ileana felt something in her chest soften in a way it hadn't in years. The children didn't question his presence. They simply welcomed him the way children do, with instinct. He never tried to replace. He didn't force his way in. He stayed at the edge of things until invited closer. He never entered their bedtime stories, but he helped fix the swing. He didn't tuck them in, but he showed Arya how to identify hummingbirds by their song. He added value without seeking credit. Ileana noticed, and appreciated it in ways words couldn't quite contain. Weeks became a rhythm. Dinner on the terrace, early morning walks through the orchard, Matteo reading books with the children beneath the sycamore near the koi pond. One Sunday, Ileana set 3 plates on the table instead of 2. No one mentioned it, but everyone noticed. That evening, as the sun bathed the vineyard in gold, Matteo lingered on the steps as Ileana cleared the dishes. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm learning to be," she answered. And that was enough. He didn't press. He didn't ask for promises or predictions. He only reached out, placed his hand lightly over hers and held it there. For a moment, Ileana didn't fall in love the way she had before. She didn't fall at all. She walked toward it, with open eyes, with boundaries, with grace. And for the first time, it didn't feel like surrendering her identity. It felt like honoring it. The seasons shifted. Spring arrived with a gentler breeze than she remembered. The orchard bore its first full bloom since everything changed. Apricot trees bowed with sweetness. Peonies pushed up through softened soil. Laughter came easily again. But the biggest change wasn't outside. It was in her. Ileana no longer braced for silence. She no longer filled space just to feel in control. She didn't live in defense. She lived in truth. And that made everything feel lighter. One morning, as Matteo tightened the fence near the southern path, Arya handed him a card she had made. A sun with 2 smiling stick figures below. "This is you and Mommy," she said without hesitation. "I like how you smile at her." Matteo blinked slowly. I like how she smiles now too. Ileana heard them from the porch. She didn't cry. She simply placed her hand over her heart and felt it still. No panic, no weight, just calm. It was in late June when Ileana invited Matteo inside, not as a guest, but as part of her story. She handed him an old journal. Inside were pages she'd written after Corvin left. Some angry, some afraid, some just scattered thoughts written at 2 a.m., so she wouldn't forget how far she'd come. He read each word without interruption. When he closed it, he looked at her with a quiet that didn't ask for more. Only offered this: you didn't just survive. You transformed. She nodded. I don't need rescuing. Matteo smiled. I never thought you did. They didn't call what they had a new beginning. It was just life now. Steady, present, uncomplicated. Ileana continued hosting women in need of refuge. Not in groups, not in a formal setting, just one by one, with tea and time and space to be human again. Some stayed for days. Others only needed a single conversation. But they all left stronger because Ileana didn't try to save them. She simply showed them what saving yourself could look like. The mansion no longer carried echoes of betrayal. It carried music, bread baking in the oven, the sound of bare feet running through hallways, a boy learning how to mend a kite, a girl planting tulips with her mother on a Saturday morning. It was never about the estate. It was about what filled it. Ileana didn't build a fortress. She built a sanctuary. And every soul who passed through its doors could feel the difference. This was never about revenge. Ileana's voice, soft but unwavering, guided the reflection like morning sun through sheer curtains. It wasn't about winning or proving anything to anyone. It was about remembering who I was before I was someone's wife, before I was someone's cautionary tale, before I forgot that peace is priceless. The orchard had grown thicker, greener. Each tree, once just a silent witness to her unraveling, now stood tall, heavy with fruit. What had once been her prison of luxury now echoed with laughter, with healing, with freedom. Women came, one by one. Some were quiet, others broken. Many carried nothing but their stories, trembling hands, and tear-stained cheeks. Ileana didn't give them sermons. She gave them space. A room, a garden path, a journal, a bowl of warm soup and permission to exist without having to explain. She didn't ask them to be strong. She reminded them that they already were. They didn't see her as the woman in the magazine articles from years ago. They saw her as a survivor who found stillness without shouting, who walked away not with bitterness, but with boundaries. I remember thinking, she continued, voice steady over a montage of her pruning lavender, laughing, beside Matteo, watching Aria paint a flower pot, that losing everything meant I had nothing left, but that was never true. I just lost what was never mine to keep, and I found everything that was. There were no court battles to speak of anymore, no headlines, no lingering lawsuits. Corvin had vanished from her life the way fog lifts from a hill, sudden and without ceremony. She didn't track him. She didn't speak his name. He was no longer the headline in her story. Kaelin asked her once, "Do you miss him?" Ileana didn't lie. "I miss the version I thought he was." The boy thought about that, then nodded as if he understood something beyond his years. "That's okay," he said. And somehow, it was. The mansion, now simply called the Grove, wasn't just a home. It was a refuge, a classroom, a bridge between loss and life again. People came from all over the state, sometimes even farther, drawn not by advertisements, but by stories whispered between friends. There's a place you can go, where they won't fix you, but they'll let you rest. Ileana didn't need a billboard. She had something stronger. Reputation born from resilience. She sat beneath the willow tree one afternoon, journal in lap, Matteo reading nearby with Aria curled against his side. Her pen moved slowly, not in grief, in gratitude. You see, her voice narrated over it all. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the woman who makes no announcements but walks away anyway. Sometimes it's in choosing silence, not out of fear, but out of strategy. It's trusting that peace doesn't need permission to take root. Ileana didn't tell people what to do with their pain. She showed them what she did with hers. She turned it into gardens, into bookshelves lined with stories of survival, into an orchard that now bore enough fruit to feed everyone who passed through her gates. She no longer sought closure. She chose growth. One morning, A young woman arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. Ileana welcomed her, gave her a robe and a notebook. No paperwork, no signatures, just trust. A week later, the girl asked, "How did you forgive him?" Ileana didn't answer right away. Instead, she led her to the orchard and handed her a shovel. "Help me plant this fig tree," she said. The young woman hesitated. What does that have to do with forgiveness? Ileana knelt down. Because some things don't need answers, they need action. They planted the tree in silence. Sometimes healing looks exactly like that. Matteo watched her from the kitchen window, admiration in his eyes, but never possession. He loved her, not for who she had been, or even who she was to him. He loved her for the way she lived without performance, the way she created safety without asking for praise, the way she made peace look powerful. At night, Ileana would walk barefoot through the orchard, not for symbolism, not for aesthetic, just because she could. The same land where she once cried alone was now where she sang lullabies, where she taught Arya how to braid rosemary into flower crowns, where Kaelin built birdhouses and asked questions about the stars. It was not a fairy tale. It was a life, and that made it sacred. If you're listening to this, I want you to know something. You don't have to scream to be strong. You don't have to shatter everything to rebuild something better. You don't need revenge to reclaim your life. You only need the courage to leave, and the patience to let yourself heal. I was once known as someone's wife, someone's secret, someone's possession. Now I'm simply Ileana, mother, gardener, builder of safe places. This isn't about what I lost. It's about what I refuse to lose, myself. The final shot is Ileana walking slowly between the orchard rows at dusk. No narration, no music, just the sound of soft leaves brushing against her fingertips. Her bare feet press into the soil that once held her grief, now growing her future. She turns toward the camera, smiles, not because everything is perfect, but because she's at peace. If this story inspired you, share it with someone walking through a storm. And if you believe quiet strength can change the world, subscribe. We're telling stories like this every week.